What would you do if you saw injustice happening right before your eyes? Would you speak up, or would you stay silent? Henry Thompson sat quietly at the corner table of a bustling diner, his worn yet clean jacket draped over his frail shoulders. At 75 years old, he had seen his fair share of life's challenges, but today, all he wanted was a peaceful moment with a hot cup of coffee. His son was running late, but Henry was patient. The soft hum of conversation filled the air, the occasional clatter of dishes and silverware punctuating the din. The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon lingered in the air, wrapping the space in a warm familiarity. Then the diner's door swung open. A gust of cold air swept in as two officers strode inside, Officer Daniels and Officer Carter. Their crisp uniforms gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their presence immediately demanding attention. They surveyed the room, their eyes landing on Henry, the only black man in the establishment. Daniels smirked, leaned toward Carter, and muttered something under his breath. Carter chuckled, nodding in agreement. To them, Henry didn't belong here. The neighborhood was predominantly white, and an elderly black man sitting alone in the corner of a nice diner seemed out of place. With an air of superiority, they approached his table, their boots clicking against the tile floor. Daniels was the first to speak. His tone wasn't friendly. It wasn't even neutral. It was sharp, demanding. "What are you doing here, old man?" No greeting, no politeness, just an immediate challenge. Henry looked up slowly from his coffee, his weathered hands resting on the table. His gaze met Daniels', calm and steady. "I'm waiting for my son," he replied, his voice measured, betraying none of the discomfort stirring inside him. Carter scoffed, shaking his head. "A little old man like you, sitting here all alone? That's unusual. Trying to fit in with the big boys, huh?" He laughed, as if he had cracked some grand joke. Henry, however, didn't react. He simply nodded once and repeated, "I'm just waiting for my son." His composure should have been disarming, but instead, it irritated the officers. Daniels wasn't satisfied with Henry's response. He stepped closer, his presence looming. "Let's see some ID." It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Henry didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and retrieved his veteran's ID card. With steady hands, he handed it over. That small, laminated card was a testament to his years of service, the sacrifices he had made, the battles he had fought for a country that hadn't always fought for him. Daniels took the card and examined it. His lip curled in disdain. "This looks fake," he muttered, flicking it back onto the table as if it were garbage. Henry exhaled slowly, but said nothing. He had encountered men like this before. Men who wielded their authority not to protect, but to belittle. He had learned long ago that engaging with their hatred only fueled it. Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "A vet, huh? Hard to believe. Back in your day, people like you weren't soldiers. More like dishwashers and janitors." Daniels laughed, nodding. "Yeah, those were the good times. When people knew their place." The words hung in the air, thick with contempt. Henry's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He could feel the stares of other diners, some glancing over with mild curiosity, others visibly uncomfortable. Yet no one intervened. Daniels crossed his arms. "You heard me. You got somewhere else to be." Henry met his gaze, unwavering. "I have every right to be here," he said evenly. "Just like everyone else." The officers didn't like that. They weren't used to being questioned, especially not by someone they deemed beneath them. The tension in the diner thickened. Conversations had hushed, and all eyes were now on their interaction. But Henry refused to back down. He had faced worse in his life. He had stood on battlefields, witnessed true horror. He had survived. And now, he was here in a diner, facing two young men who thought a badge made them powerful. Daniels leaned in, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You don't belong here, old man. And if you don't leave, we'll make you." Henry remained seated, his hand steady on the table. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't reckless either. He knew that men like these were looking for an excuse, any excuse, to escalate the situation. He wouldn't give it to them. Seconds passed. The officers waited for a reaction, some sign of submission. But Henry simply took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down with quiet finality. Daniels exhaled sharply, clearly growing impatient. He was used to people folding under pressure, complying without question. But this old man, this quiet veteran, wasn't playing his game. Carter's smirk faltered slightly. Perhaps, deep down, he realized they were making a mistake. Perhaps he sensed the growing unease in the room. But Daniels? He wasn't about to back down. The room was silent now. The other patrons watched, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others frozen in place. The weight of the moment settled over everyone. Henry knew this was far from over, and so did the officers. If you were in Henry's place, how would you react? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share this story if you believe respect should be given to all. Daniels held up the veteran's ID card between his fingers, turning it over as if he were inspecting a counterfeit bill. His lip curled in a smirk. "This is supposed to be real," he scoffed, tossing it carelessly onto the table. The small laminated card slid across the worn wooden surface, coming to rest near Henry's coffee cup. Carter chuckled beside him, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "A soldier? You," he said, his voice thick with derision. "That's hard to imagine. Back in your day, folks like you weren't exactly in combat, were they? More like kitchen duty, I'd bet." Henry didn't flinch. He had faced worse than the scorn of two young men who mistook cruelty for power. He had fought battles on foreign soil, stood in the face of death, and endured struggles long after the war ended. He had survived, and survival had taught him patience. His silence wasn't submission. It was control. But his silence only fueled their contempt. Daniels leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. "You don't belong here, old man," he sneered. "Why don't you finish up and move along before you make people uncomfortable?" The air in the diner shifted. The lively chatter that had filled the space moments ago had dwindled into hushed whispers. A few patrons stole glances in Henry's direction, eyes flicking between him and the officers. Some averted their gaze entirely, pretending they hadn't noticed at all. Others looked on with expressions of unease, lips slightly parted as if they wanted to say something, but couldn't find the courage to speak. Henry remained still, his fingers curled lightly around the handle of his coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into his palm. He exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling with the steady breath of a man who refused to be rattled. Daniel straightened up and exchanged a glance with Carter. There was an unspoken challenge in Henry's composure, one that neither of them appreciated. Daniels had expected compliance, fear, anything other than this quiet resilience. Carter took a step closer, his voice lowering into something almost conspiratorial. "Look, we're trying to be reasonable here," he said. "But a man like you in a place like this, you know it doesn't look right." He gestured vaguely around the room, as if to summon the silent agreement of the other diners. No one moved. Henry lifted his gaze, meeting Carter's eyes with a steadiness that made the officer shift uncomfortably. Daniels, sensing his partner's hesitation, decided to escalate. Without warning, he reached out and shoved Henry's chair backward. The wooden legs scraped against the floor with a harsh screech before tipping over completely. The impact echoed through the diner. A collective gasp rippled through the patrons as Henry hit the ground, the breath momentarily knocked from his chest. Coffee sloshed over the table's edge, dripping onto the floor in slow, deliberate drops. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was absolute. Then, a fork clattered against a plate in the distance, a small, inconsequential sound that somehow shattered the stillness. A woman near the counter covered her mouth with her hands. A man in a booth shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around his napkin. But no one stood. No one spoke. Daniels loomed over Henry, his smirk widening. "Maybe now you'll understand what we're saying," he muttered. Henry, steady as ever, exhaled through his nose. He braced his palm against the floor and began to push himself up, slow but deliberate. His joints ached, but he had been through worse, much worse. Carter glanced around, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on them. He shifted from foot to foot, his earlier bravado cracking just a little. "Daniels, maybe we should." Daniels ignored him. He wasn't done yet. "What's wrong, old man?" he taunted. "Too tired to stand." Henry, finally back on his feet, dusted off his coat with a steady hand. He looked at Daniels, then at Carter. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any insult they could throw at him. The tension in the diner was suffocating. Everyone had seen. Everyone had heard. And yet no one moved. No one intervened. A man at a nearby table gripped his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. A waitress behind the counter shifted uneasily, glancing toward the manager, who merely shook his head. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to be next. Henry knew this silence all too well. He had heard it before, in different forms, at different times in his life. It was the silence of bystanders who knew what was happening was wrong but chose the safety of inaction. Daniel smirked, clearly satisfied. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," he said. Henry didn't move. The question now was no longer what Henry would do. It was what everyone else would. What would you have done if you were there? Would you have stepped in or stayed silent? Daniels took a step closer, towering over Henry as he reached for his belt, his hand resting on his pair of handcuffs. Carter, still smirking, bent down and snatched Henry's veteran cap off the table, turning it over in his hands with mock curiosity. "This old thing," Carter mused aloud, running his fingers along the faded lettering. "Worn out, just like its owner." Without hesitation, he let it slip from his fingers, letting it fall to the floor as if it were nothing more than a piece of trash. Henry remained still. His face betrayed no emotion, his hands resting calmly at his sides. He had faced men like this before, young, reckless, and drunk on their own power. He knew that any sign of anger, any flicker of defiance, would only fuel them further. But Carter wasn't done. His gaze dropped to the sturdy wooden cane leaning against Henry's chair. The same cane Henry had relied on for years, a reminder of the battles he had fought and the wounds he had carried home. Carter scooped it up, twirling it lazily in his hand. Daniels chuckled. "What do you need this for, old man? Can't stand on your own anymore." Henry said nothing. He simply watched. Carter grinned, gripping the cane at both ends. Then, without warning, he brought it down hard against his knee. The wood cracked, splitting into two jagged pieces. A sharp gasp rippled through the diner, and for the first time, a few patrons pushed back from their seats. The soft murmur of unease that had been hovering in the air grew into something more, outrage. A woman near the counter whispered, "This is too much." A man in the booth closest to the scene muttered a curse under his breath. Even the waitress behind the counter had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the register. But still no one moved. Henry let his eyes drop to the broken cane, its remains lying in splinters at his feet. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself, before lifting his gaze back to Carter. There was no rage in his expression, no indignation, just a quiet disappointment, as if he had expected nothing more from them. Daniel's patience was running thin. He had expected more resistance, a reaction, anything to justify what they were doing. The silence, the dignity in Henry's restraint, it only made him angrier. "That's it," he growled, yanking the cuffs from his belt. "You're coming with us." He grabbed Henry's wrist roughly, twisting it behind his back, before snapping the cold metal shut around it. The sharp click echoed through the diner, cutting through the thick tension in the air. Henry winced, but he didn't struggle. He didn't argue. He just let it happen. Carter, still riding the high of his cruelty, leaned in close. "Hope you enjoy a night in a cell, old man. Maybe next time, you'll learn not to step where you don't belong." The diner had fallen into a hushed horror. The patrons, once too afraid to speak, now exchanged looks of disbelief. Some had pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Others sat stiffly in their seats, their faces lined with an internal battle. Speak up, or stay silent. Daniels gripped Henry's shoulder, giving him a rough shove toward the door. "Move it." Henry stumbled slightly, but caught himself, straightening his posture as much as his aching body would allow. He turned his head slightly, giving one last sweeping glance at the faces surrounding him. Some were filled with quiet sympathy, others with shame. But all of them, every single one, had remained in their seats. And then, with a heavy exhale, Henry took his first step toward the exit. Do you think the officers went too far? Type yes if you agree, or no if you think otherwise. Henry barely reacted as Daniels yanked him forward, his old body forced to follow the officer's grip. His steps were slow but steady, and despite the rough treatment, his face remained unreadable. As he moved past his table, his eyes flickered downward, landing on the small card that had been left there. It hadn't been touched in the commotion, still lying exactly where he had placed it. He made no move toward it, no indication of its significance, but he didn't need to. His quiet gaze was enough. Daniels, noticing Henry's glance, hesitated. His curiosity got the best of him, and with a scoff he reached down, snatching up the card as if expecting it to be another meaningless relic from an old man. He turned it over in his hands, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. Then, his eyes locked onto the bold print across the front. Commissioner Robert Thompson. The blood drained from Daniel's face so quickly it was as if all the arrogance had been physically pulled from his body. His grip on Henry's arm loosened involuntarily, his breath catching in his throat. Carter, seeing the sudden change in his partner, frowned and leaned over to look. The moment he read the name, his smirk vanished, replaced with a stunned, almost panicked expression. The diner, once a stage for their unchecked authority, had now become a courtroom, and the jury, the patrons surrounding them, was watching closely. Murmurs rippled through the room as people began to grasp the situation. Those who had kept silent now reached for their phones, realizing that this was a moment worth capturing. Screens lit up. Cameras pointed toward the officers and the elderly man they had humiliated. Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. His tongue felt thick, his throat dry. He had spent the last 10 minutes degrading, belittling, and physically manhandling the father of the most powerful law enforcement figure in the city. A man who could, with a single call, end their careers. Henry said nothing. He didn't have to. His steady, knowing gaze was enough. He had seen men crumble under pressure before, on the battlefield, in the streets, in situations far worse than this. And he recognized the shift in these two men, the realization that they had stepped too far, pushed beyond what could be excused. The weight of their mistakes settled onto their shoulders, and it was heavier than any badge they carried. Carter was the first to move, straightening his posture as if trying to reclaim some of his lost authority. "Listen, old man," he started, but the words died on his lips. There was no saving face now. Daniels finally found his voice, though it was weaker than before. We didn't know who you were," he stammered, his fingers tightening around the card as if holding it might somehow change the reality they were facing. Henry exhaled through his nose, a sound that was almost amused, almost disappointed. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The two men were unraveling all on their own. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional shudder sound of a phone camera capturing the moment. The officers had gone from enforcers of the law to men standing trial in the court of public opinion, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Carter took a half step back, his confidence completely eroded. "We didn't mean—" He stopped, realizing there was nothing he could say that would undo what had already been done. Daniels cleared his throat, his voice nearly a whisper now. "Sir, I—" But Henry didn't wait to hear the excuse. He simply looked at him for a long moment before turning his gaze toward the door. His message was clear. He was done here. The weight of the moment pressed down on the officers as they stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The eyes of every diner patron bore into them, their judgment unspoken but deafening. They weren't just watching. They were recording, remembering. There would be no erasing this. The door to the diner hadn't moved since they had arrived. But now, it felt like an exit to a world they no longer controlled, a world where their mistakes had consequences. If you were Henry, would you forgive them or demand justice? The door to the diner swung open with a forceful creak, sending a hush through the already tense room. A tall man stepped inside, his broad shoulders framed by the dim afternoon light spilling in from outside. His presence commanded attention without a single word, and as soon as his eyes landed on the scene before him, the atmosphere shifted. Commissioner Robert Thompson. He didn't need anyone to explain what had happened. The moment he saw his father standing there, his posture unwavering despite the humiliation he had just endured, he understood everything. His sharp gaze moved from Henry to the two officers, and the weight of his disappointment hit them harder than any reprimand ever could. Daniels and Carter stiffened, their arrogant facades crumbling. Just moments ago, they had been in control, their voices the only ones that mattered. But now, under the commissioner's stare, they fumbled, their mouths opening and closing as they scrambled for an explanation. "Sir, Daniel started, but his voice faltered. He swallowed hard before trying again. "There was a misunderstanding. We didn't know who he was." Carter nodded quickly, seizing onto the excuse. "That's right, sir. We were just doing our job. We didn't mean any." But before he could finish, Robert Thompson raised a hand, silencing them with a simple gesture. He didn't need to hear their excuses. Their actions had already spoken louder than any justification they could muster. He exhaled slowly, his disappointment more cutting than outright anger. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured but firm. "It doesn't matter who he is. Every citizen deserves respect." The words hung heavy in the air, a simple truth that neither Daniels nor Carter could argue against. They stood frozen, their faces draining of any remaining confidence. Robert turned his attention fully to them, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You will leave this establishment immediately, and you will report to my office first thing tomorrow morning." Daniels hesitated, glancing at Carter as if hoping for some kind of support. But there was none to be found. The weight of the commissioner's authority pressed down on them, leaving them with no choice but to comply. With stiff movements, Daniels reached for his belt, unclipping the handcuffs that bound Henry's wrists. The metal clattered onto the table as he freed him, but Henry didn't rub at his wrists or react in any way. He simply met Daniels' gaze with that same quiet resilience, the kind of strength that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The two officers turned to leave, their movements mechanical, their backs stiff with the shame that now settled in. As they walked toward the door, they could feel the eyes of the entire diner on them, and not a single person spoke up in their defense. Not one. When the door closed behind them, the silence in the room remained. It wasn't until Robert turned back to his father that the tension seemed to ease slightly. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so that only Henry could hear. "I'm sorry." Henry, ever steady, studied his son for a long moment before nodding. He had never asked for an apology. He didn't need one. His son's actions spoke for themselves. The patrons in the diner slowly began to murmur among themselves, some shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed, others taking out their phones to send messages or post online. The weight of what had just happened would spread beyond these four walls. It would be remembered. And as Henry finally took a seat again, reclaiming his place at the table where his dignity had never truly left, Robert sat down across from him, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Do you think the punishment was fair? Comment yes or no, and tell us why." Robert Thompson sat down across from his father, his hand steady as he retrieved the key from his pocket. With a quiet click, he unlocked the cuffs that still bound Henry's wrists. The cold metal clattered against the table as he set them aside, an unnecessary reminder of everything that had just transpired. For a moment neither man spoke. Robert exhaled slowly, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his own shame. He had arrived too late, not just to stop what had happened, but to prevent his father from ever having to endure such an indignity in the first place. "I'm sorry, Dad," Robert said at last, his voice measured but firm. "Not just for being late, for all of it." His fingers clenched against the tabletop. "You deserved better than that." Henry studied his son with an expression that was neither bitter nor angry. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know that justice was often delayed, and that the true measure of a man was how he chose to act when faced with the consequences of injustice. Instead of anger, he smiled small, but knowing. "I know," Henry replied simply. "But you came." It was a statement of fact, but also something more. It was a testament to the kind of man Robert had become. Henry had raised a son who understood right from wrong, who did not hesitate to correct those who misused their power. That was enough for him. The events of that afternoon did not stay contained within the walls of the small diner. By the time Henry and Robert had finished their meal, the incident had already begun to spread. The diners who had recorded the confrontation uploaded the videos to social media, and within hours, thousands of people had watched what had taken place. The city reacted swiftly. The police department issued a public statement acknowledging the misconduct, and an internal investigation was launched. Daniels and Carter were placed on immediate suspension pending review, but the verdict was clear even before the official decision was made. The next morning, it was announced that both officers were to be suspended without pay for 6 months and required to attend extensive training on implicit bias, ethics, and community policing. Some thought the punishment too lenient. Others saw it as a necessary step toward reform. But what mattered most to Henry was that the injustice had not gone unnoticed. The silence of the diner had been replaced with action. People were paying attention, and change, even if slow, was happening. Henry knew the world was far from perfect. He had lived through decades of change, through promises kept and broken, through moments of progress and moments of despair. But sitting across from his son, seeing the way Robert had handled the situation, not with anger, but with firm, unwavering justice, gave him hope. Hope that, despite everything, there were still people who believed in doing what was right. Hope that the lessons of the past were not forgotten, and that those in power could still be held accountable. Hope that his fight had not been in vain. He picked up his coffee cup, now lukewarm, and took a sip. When he set it down, he looked at Robert with a small grin. "Well," he said, "at least the food's still good." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess that's something." Outside, the world carried on. But inside that small diner, a lesson had been learned. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would not be forgotten. What's your biggest takeaway from this story? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe in justice for all.